over $14 billion was spent on the 2020 US presidential elections.
2020, the most expensive in history.
The cost of this year's election will top $14 billion.
I want to talk about Wall Street donations in the world of politics right now.
Welcome to History Meets Finance, and today we're going to talk about the strange history of campaign donations in US elections. $14.4 billion was spent on political campaigning in the 2020 elections, and that made it the most expensive election in US history. Now, a part of that was self-financed, but the majority of the funds came through donations, which means that a lot of this money comes from big business interests. So that begs the question, why is this even legal? That's why I wanted to do a deep dive into the history of election donations. How do they work? And most importantly, why do they remain legal with very few regulations? Alright, let's start at the beginning. Ever since the US gained independence, their aspiring politicians had one thing to figure out: how to reach voters across such a large country. And for that, they needed money. A lot of it. That's why you actually see that many politicians early in the nation's history came from wealth. They came from well-connected backgrounds. But then there was Andrew Jackson. He was the first politician who came from very humble beginnings. And despite his very troubling legacy, he was one of the first politicians to experiment with strategies that are used even today. And that includes using a campaign staff to raise money, to secure votes, and to organize committees and rallies to help spread the message. And this form of political campaigning gave him an edge. He was able to secure his title as the 7th President of the United States. And taking note of his success, other politicians would also follow suit in the years that followed. Collecting donations became an essential element of any political campaign. And this was viewed as healthy for democracy. It actually involved ordinary people and encouraged them to take a more vested interest in their political leadership, rather than just being a passive observer and just showing up for voting. However, after the Civil War, the situation would take a turn for the worse. This was a time when the US was rapidly industrializing, and as you would expect, this created some immensely rich families. And it became very clear to these families that their newfound wealth could be used to exploit the political system. The takeover of American politics by big businesses had begun. In fact, the situation became so bad that it was entirely big businesses that were determining who would win. This is how William McKinley was able to secure victory. His campaign was backed by capital and marketing efforts of JP Morgan and Standard Oil. McKinley was also tremendously influenced by Marcus Hanna, the Republican Party chair, who in turn raised massive sums of money from industrialists and big businesses. So you can see how much of an influence the private sector had at this time. And then came Teddy Roosevelt. He entered the scene and tried to change things up a bit. He tried to create a situation where the influence of big businesses on politics was reduced. In fact, he attempted to outlaw all sorts of political contributions. However, he was not successful. He proposed this idea to Congress of outlawing corporate contributions, but he was met with a lot of resistance. This was bound to happen because the elected officials in charge of making these decisions in Congress were themselves beholden to their donors. Despite this resistance, some laws would eventually get passed that limited donations from businesses. This includes reforms such as the Tillman Act of 1907 and the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1925 that prohibited corporations from making any direct financial contributions to political campaigns. Yet all of these acts were full of loopholes and extremely difficult to enforce. They were either ineffective or they could easily be circumvented. It was only in 1971 that Congress finally passed a workable act known as the Federal Election Campaign Act. This aimed at bringing more transparency to corporate donations. In the years that followed, more amendments would be passed, and further limitations to political campaigns would be addressed. However, many of these would be struck down by the US Supreme Court. Their ruling was that these laws were unconstitutional violations, and we see a repeat of the US Supreme Court intervening to strike down these laws related to donation limits in the 80s, in the 90s, all the way to the present. Despite this, some laws were successfully passed. However, if you were to compare the situation today to what it was a century ago, in reality not much has changed. What is an achievement though is that the donation money does not directly go to the candidates, putting some limitation on corruption. Instead, more money now flows indirectly into election campaigns through political action committees, or PACs for short. Now, there are two kinds of PACs. A traditional PAC, which represents specific interests. They usually have limits on how much money they can receive or donate for a campaign. But the second one is called a super PAC.
The super PACs.
A super PAC.
These super PACs are.
You probably heard about super PACs constantly on the news. Super PACs can raise an unlimited amount of money from businesses, but cannot directly donate the money to political candidates. Instead, the money has to be spent on election campaigns independently, which in my opinion seems like the same thing but with extra steps. Because of no limits, these super PACs can generate a hefty sum of money in support of political candidates. So those were super PACs. There's also another way in which political campaign donations could circumvent these regulations, and those would be through these so-called 501c nonprofits. Like super PACs, these nonprofits have no limits on receiving and donating money. However, unlike a super PAC, they do not have to disclose their donors. For the nonprofits, the only real limitation is that the political activity has to make up a small portion of their operations, and what that limit on political activity should be is a continuing topic of debate. So as you can see, there are many ways to get around these so-called regulations around political campaigns. Again, if we roll the tape back to 100 years ago, it's still the same story. There are all these laws and legal limitations, but finding loopholes is easy and enforcement is tough. The core idea of business interests influencing political outcomes is still very much real, and unfortunately that influence is as effective today as it was a century ago. Given that democracy is one of the people, by the people, for the people, does it really make sense to tolerate businesses pouring millions of dollars into influencing the political process? I'm assuming that most people would say a resounding no. By the way, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel and leave a comment down below about what you think about this topic. What's your take on political contributions by big businesses in the US? Anyway, finding a solution to the problem of corporate donations influencing politicians is not easy to find, and that's why so many laws get struck down by the Supreme Court. Because like it or not, some of these proposed laws do infringe on constitutional rights, and the most important of that is freedom of expression. As we learned, most political donations aren't received or spent directly by the candidate. Rather, they're done so independently by others on the campaign's behalf. Thus, regulating this leads to a conflict on the constitutional rights of entities, and that right is the American right to join together for a political process to promote candidates and issues. Because of this indirect nature of political donations, it can be difficult to pinpoint what is and what isn't a bribe. To qualify for a bribe, it must have explicitly influenced the politician to agree and undertake a specific and certain action. That's why it's hard to draw a connection between these contributions and bribery. It's just not that clear and simple. Donating organizations don't actually go to politicians and ask them to return the favor. Instead, they strategically donate to politicians whose stances best align with their interests. And on the other side of the coin, politicians proactively take stances where they think that they're going to get the most political donations. And lastly, regulations can also create a moral hazard. You see, it's not just big businesses and these big interests that are creating these large political campaigns. Organizations that represent the interest of a specific portion of ordinary citizens also use the same donation channels as do the big businesses. So shutting down those channels or limiting those channels can also indirectly limit citizen-specific causes from being conveyed to politicians. So it's all in this delicate balance. Trying to influence any part of this equation creates a problem. Does one try to keep the core identity of the American nature, which is the freedom of expression and rights? Or does one try to keep the political process completely free of any direct or indirect corporate influence? Now, because nobody has been able to successfully answer this question, because of this dilemma, for decades, for centuries even, the issues of political contributions and undue influence has never been solved. So we've talked about how the system of campaign donations has led to a situation where big businesses and corporations can enjoy an undue influence on the political process. However, this problem persists because of the inability to find the proper means to regulate donations without violating constitutional rights. And in my view, this issue is probably not going to be solved for a very long time, unfortunately. If you like this video, I'm sure you'll enjoy this video about the history of taxation and how it changed over time. So check it out here, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.